Over the last few decades, the US dollar has ruled the global trade arena with unparalleled dominance that helped shape the global economy as we know it today. However, this now appears to be changing. The trend of de-dollarization and using the dollar less and less in global trade between countries has been increasing more and more rapidly. Just recently, the BRICS countries have officially decided to abandon the US dollar from being used for paying for different goods and services when they trade with each other. This decision marks a turning point in the global economy and has some important ramifications on the US dollar. Also, the recent joining of 6 new countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE, which are one of the largest oil producers in the world, has significant implications for what is known as the petrodollar. The BRICS countries combined altogether now have up to 80% control over oil production. They have their own bank called the New Development Bank, which is sort of like their own separate version of the World Bank and the IMF. And they've also created their own payment system called BRICS Pay, which is very similar to the SWIFT payment system and could even serve as an alternative to it. In addition, their population combined makes up around 50% of the total world's population, with even more countries expected to join. So the BRICS countries now hold a very significant role in the whole global economy and are currently reshaping the global financial system as we know it today. And by moving away from the US dollar, the BRICS countries are taking a bold step towards establishing a new global financial order that is less dependent on the dominance of the current existing one. But what does this really mean for the US dollar? And is there a way for the average investor to hedge against a potential economic crisis that could be caused by this or even potentially benefit from it? But before we continue answering these questions, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now, a huge part of why the US dollar holds a significant weight globally and has continued to have the world's reserve currency status is mainly because of what's so-called the petrodollar. In 1973, the US and Saudi Arabia reached an agreement that brought the petrodollar into existence. Under this agreement, Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations agreed to price and sell their oil exclusively in US dollars, in return for mainly military aid and protection. But because of the recent geopolitical issues and the war in Ukraine, and because of the economic sanctions against Russia, things have started to change rapidly, more than they did before. These economic sanctions, which resulted in billions of dollars being frozen, as well as the banning of Russia from the SWIFT payment system, had a large effect not only on the Russian economy alone, but even beyond that. Many other countries, especially those who were already part of the BRICS, also felt the pressure themselves and feared that this situation would also happen to their own economies and to their own funds as well. This created the urge for many countries to be less dependent on the SWIFT payment system as well as the US dollar, and made them want to look for an alternative. So therefore now, the BRICS countries officially decided to abandon using the US dollar in their own trades together, with the recent joining of 6 new countries, with even many more countries are also expected to join. So what does this really mean for the US dollar and the petrodollar specifically? Well, the dollar is still king and it is still the world's reserve currency. However, its world's reserve currency status is slowly losing momentum. And even though the international demand and the foreign exchange reserves holdings of the dollar are slowly going down according to this chart, it is still the world's leading currency. The second largest competing currency now, which is the euro, is very far behind. And so is the case when it comes to other currencies like the yen and the British pound. Even the Chinese renminbi, or the yuan as it is called, it is still very much less in demand and use, and it's not enough for it to replace the dollar yet. However, when it comes to the petrodollar specifically and the use of the greenback in oil exports, that will probably never be the same again, since some of the largest oil exporters in the world now officially decided to abandon the US dollar. Now, some of the potential consequences of abandoning the petrodollar could lead to less international demand for the dollar. This could mean more restricted ability for the Federal Reserve to print money and to finance the deficit, and also potentially a higher inflation rate if such money printing would occur in the future during a recession, which is very likely. This higher inflation will mainly be caused by less international demand for the dollar and even more supply, which would be available in that case. The habit of printing money and buying up assets when there's an economic downturn has almost always been the case recently for the Federal Reserve to deal with such an event, ever since the 2008 global financial crisis when it happened for the first time in modern times. We saw that also repeating at the beginning of 2020 during the market sell-off. We can clearly see in this chart how the Fed's balance sheet started to expand enormously in 2008 and beyond, and especially recently in 2020 when it jumped from $4 trillion up to $7 trillion within just a few months. And the consequences of that were the massive inflation that we have been witnessing globally for a while, and the very high increase in the cost of living, because more money right now is chasing fewer goods and services. Now, some of the ways that an average investor could hedge against such scenarios repeating in the future and what seems to be an endless weakening of the dollar's purchasing power is to own commodities, especially like gold, as an insurance against that. Many of the BRICS countries like China and Russia have been accumulating a lot of gold recently, and we can clearly see that being represented in these charts that show the amount of gold held or controlled by their own central banks. Another way to potentially even benefit from the rise of certain emerging economies within the BRICS countries is to own some specific ETFs. Many hedge funds and big investors get exposure to emerging markets and their fast-growing economies through investing in ETFs, or simply by buying and holding shares of individual companies. Investing and holding shares of individual companies is the way that Warren Buffett follows, for example, by holding shares in a Chinese EV car manufacturer, which is BYD. Last but not least is owning some Bitcoin. We have been seeing recently a lot of big players wanting to join the space. BlackRock, for example, has applied to launch a Bitcoin ETF together with other big financial institutions in the US. Also in Europe, we saw the first ever spot Bitcoin ETF, which was launched very recently. So this seems to be just the beginning for Bitcoin, and there's also a lot of growth potential for it in the coming months as more and more money flows towards it. But since this is not financial advice, you should always remember to do your own research before investing your hard-earned money into anything. But overall, the whole financial system in the world right now is witnessing some fundamentally new changes, and a new parallel system, which is the BRICS system, is emerging slowly, especially as more and more countries are expected to join. This could bring both advantages and disadvantages depending on how an investor's portfolio is allocated. But the one thing that is for sure is that the world is apparently moving more and more towards polarization and becoming multipolar. This also applies when it comes to the internal situation within many countries around the world. There's an increasing division between the left and the right regarding very basic and fundamental matters. And many of these signs are usually the typical signs of an ending long-term debt cycle that is unfolding right in front of us. So that was it for this video. If you found this helpful, make sure to leave a thumbs up and to subscribe to the channel. And with that being said, see you in the next one.